We are very fortunate to have three extremely distinguished leaders of local institutions that are significant far beyond our borders, significant nationally and internationally in higher education. I think all of you know each of them by reputation, if not in person. You have biographies, so I don't want to take too much time in introducing each of them. Dan Mote, the president of the University of Maryland, Sidney Ribeau, the president of Howard University, and of course John DeGioia, president of Georgetown University. What we're going to do today is have a conversation about some issues relating to higher education. And as always at Aspen events, we hope that much of the discussion today will involve those of you here with questions and conversation with our panelists. I thought we might start, given that this seems to be the season or the year of the deficit and financial challenges and discussions of costs, with the challenge that exists with respect to the cost of higher education. One doesn't need to be a parent to know how daunting that challenge is. I actually have 4 children in college at the moment, so I'm reminded of
oh my God.
all the time. Don't ask.
We might want to start asking you if we're
But you know, the costs keep going up, and I think most of us are familiar with many of the statistics. Since 1983, the costs of higher education have gone up 439%. At the same time, family income has gone up 147%. And even with all the attention paid to escalating medical costs exceeding inflation, medical costs during that period have gone up 251%. Pell Grants, the quintessential source of funds for lower income students to attend a higher education, so central to the American dream. When they started in 1980, the typical cost of a public 4-year institution was about $2,500. A private institution was about $5,600. The Pell Grant was $1,750, so it was about 70% of the cost of a public institution. It was about 30% of the private institution. Today, the Pell Grant is about 30% of a public institution and less than 10% of a private institution. Lots of other ways we can look at the costs. We know they're enormous. We know the rates of student defaults are going up. I'd like to ask each of our panelists their own perspectives on this problem. What is the cause? What is the solution? What can we do about it? Obviously, it has enormous implications, and we'll in a few minutes move on to talk about the particular implications for access to higher education on the part of lower income students. But Dan, we were just talking about this before, and you had some interesting observations about what costs really are and how they matter.
Well, Elliot, I think you're talking about costs to the students, or are you talking about the cost of education itself from all sources? I want to make sure. I believe, of course, university is expensive. It costs $8,000 a year for tuition and fees at the University of Maryland, a little less than daycare. And sending your child to a private grammar school or high school is much more expensive. But the cost for higher education really comes from, the support for it comes from 3 sources. It comes from tuition and fees, as I described. It comes from state general fund supports at public universities. And then it comes from resources the university generates itself. So at the University of Maryland, for example, students from their tuition and fees will generate a little less than 25% of the cost. And it costs around $23,000 a year to educate a student at the University of Maryland, of which the tuition fees will pay $8,000. In these comparisons, if you look, you use the date 1980. If you look at 1978 to 1980, Americans paid 1% of personal income in tax that went to higher education. 1%. That was the high point of the country's investment through tax bases in higher education. Started in 1954 at less than 1%, and way less than 1%, worked its way up, and then it's been going down steadily ever since. Now it's less than 0.5% of personal income from the states in the tax base goes to support higher education. Because the states have acquired a lot of other responsibilities, health care, security, and so forth, all of which are very important. I'm not suggesting that. But you'll notice the cost of tuition for students, its rise started at the same time the states started being unable to continue their support for higher education. So there's a correlation there. They're not discorrelated. They are, in fact, strongly correlated. I'm not suggesting the states need to turn this around or whether they can turn this around. We obviously spend all our time in the legislature trying to suggest that they turn it around, but reality is such that they have
It could be worse. You could be in California.
Yeah, it could be in California. But I think even with Berkeley's budget cuts, it still gets more than we do, by the way. I'm not complaining about that. I'm just saying that the picture is complicated. You've got the university's generated resources, you've got the tuition and fees from the students, and you've got essentially state general fund. Also, tuition itself is not the best measure of the cost of higher education. We have a student that comes to the University of Maryland will pay, if they're a resident student living in a residence hall, they'll pay $19,000 to $20,000 a year for that experience. $9,000 for room and board, $8,000 for tuition, a couple of $1,000s for books, and then beer, entertainment, various other things that happens, another $1,000 or so. So you add that up and you come to $19,000 to $20,000. Where in earlier times, when students lived at home, they didn't. The room and board cost was something that didn't show up in higher education cost. That was a family cost, not a higher education cost. So a lot of costs have been added to creating the educational experience of a university campus experience for students. So that has changed a lot over the time you mentioned, where now universities are creating an educational experience which is much richer than it was, let's say, in the 1980s or 70s and earlier. But I think the point I'd like to make is that how do you decide that the costs are too high? I mean, that's a real good question. And in fact, are the costs too high for everybody? Or are they only too high for somebody? And I've worried a lot about this, and we have been concentrating on, as a measure of whether the costs are too high, on debt at graduation, trying to control debt at graduation for students. Because debt at graduation determines what you subsequently are able to do, whether you're able to go to graduate school, whether you're able to get a job, whether you can buy a house, whether you can start a company, and so forth, and what kind of major you may take, and also what kind of jobs you may get subsequently. Very much debt at graduation is a controlling issue. And so what universities can do about cost, for example, you can set out programs to control debt at graduation. You can set out programs to fund students who are likely to acquire debt at graduation. You can control the maximum debt at graduation through scholarships and other means. That's a way of targeting limited money to certain students who are likely to accumulate large debt at graduation. I think that is a technique we have been using to try to control the cost to the student.
Thank you. Sidney, your institution historically has played a pivotal role in providing access to higher education to many students who otherwise traditionally or economically be able to receive a college degree. How is Howard dealing with this challenge today? And perhaps you could also address the particular challenge of access to students of color and how this crisis is indeed expanding for that population.
Sure. Obviously, given the history of Howard and the genesis of institutions like Howard, access is very, very important. We are today and will remain access institutions. But just as other institutions, as Georgetown or University of Maryland, our students and their families grapple with the issue of how do you pay for it? How do you meet the financial obligations? I think President Mote's differentiation between cost to the students and cost to providing education is a very important distinction. Just like any other business operation, I separate higher education, the intellectual part of it, from the business of it. We have fixed costs. We have debt service to pay, we have food to buy, we have salaries to meet. So like any other business that is impacted by the variances in the economy, we have to adjust to those costs. We can't, just because we're a not-for-profit, act like those things don't exist. So there are certain costs, and I'll give you one example of unallocated cost that has emerged in the last 10 to 15 years, technology. I mean, there was a time that, infrastructures and networks that cost millions of dollars, and the technology needs that students want and need in their academic preparation, and in fact they need to do their research, it just wasn't there. You didn't really have that huge obligation. I remember when I was in Ohio before coming to Howard at a state-assisted institution, we finally got the legislature to see that technology costs were capital costs because it wasn't a building. They didn't understand it, but it was a multi-million-dollar investment. So we have costs like any other business, and we have to address those costs and try to manage those costs. That being said, I in my mind, like to differentiate between what it actually, costs the students and what the sticker price is. Most of the students that I would venture to say all of our institutions are receiving financial aid, merit-based scholarships in many cases, some need-based scholarships. But if you look at the actual, if it's $30,000 and what a typical student or average student might pay, he or she might be paying after, the merit scholarships and laureate scholarships, the others from other foundations and sources, it might come down to, in a case of Howard, $5,000 to $6,000, $7,000. And so what we've done specifically on the access question is to have our private giving, our advancement areas, identified need-based financial aid to offset the differential between what the parent can pay, what scholarships pay, and what the student need really is. And I think all of our institutions do things like that. So if you deconstruct the numbers and you actually identify what students are unable to meet, unmet need, the numbers really aren't as large as depicted in many of the periodicals that we see. And I think all of our institutions are committed to addressing that unmet need so that students have an access to our institutions. Our applications, and I suspect I can speak to that in more detail than the other institutions, are up. And our challenge is to make sure each of those students, when we do the analysis, is able to come. Because what we've said historically is that if you have the academic preparation and the desire, we'll find a way for you to be able to attend Howard University. So we're grappling with that. And I think perhaps we'll talk about this later, where we're finding a great challenge, and it's not the cost factor, it's attracting African American males. And it's not just at Howard, as we were talking before coming in here, all of our institutions are really.
What were you saying before? It was actually the percentage of that cohort that.
Well, what's interesting, I was recently at the, last week, the College Board had this panel discussion. It had congressional representation, and I was invited to participate. And it was talking about the underrepresentations of males of color in higher education. And these are some numbers. 14.3 million undergraduates are enrolled in American colleges and universities. Men in general represent 42% of the total student population. African American men represent less than 4 to 8% of the total student population nationally. That's in four-year institutions, which is just unheard of. I tracked this data pretty carefully, but I had no idea that the numbers were actually this low. And so I think that's another issue. And part of it is academic preparation, the percentage that are getting out of high school, but part of it is also the financial means to be able to get into a Howard or to a Maryland or to a Georgetown.
President DeGioia, not just from a Georgetown perspective, but you're also very active nationally on issues relating to higher education.
Right.
What is your response to this apparently expanding problem?
Sure. Let me answer it from two different perspectives. One, building from my colleagues and providing a Georgetown perspective on it, because I think each of our institutions are a bit different in terms of how we're organized, how we're the economics of our institutions, and how we try to ensure that we can meet the cost of the expense base that we carry. But then I'll offer one other perspective that perhaps might be helpful. In our context as a private university, we are what would be referred to in higher education as a need-blind, full need school. And what that means is when a student applies to the university, we are unaware of their financial capacity when we make the decision regarding their admission. So we're making the decision on the basis of their talent, their ability, their promise, their potential, and our desire to have them as a part of our university community. Once they're admitted, we're then committed to meeting the full cost of their education with them and their families. Well, what does that entail? We ask that each of our applicants who believes that they need financial aid to fill out a form, rather detailed form, in which they try to present their family capacity, their family income, and their family worth. From that, we determine what the parents are able to pay. And we ask the parents to pay the maximum amount that emerges from that analysis. We then ask the students to do a few things. We ask that they borrow the maximum amount under the student loan program, which over 4 years, if they borrow the maximum amount, roughly equates to $25,000 of total borrowing over the course of 4 years at the undergraduate level. We also ask that they work during the summer and work on our campus in the College Work-Study program between 8 and 15 hours a week, depending on where they are during their years with us. If you sort of take all that together, what the parents are able to pay, maximum borrowing over 4 years, and work both summer and during the school year, and subtract that from the full cost of education, that's what Georgetown steps in and pays. And so our current cost for education is about $53,000 a year. And right now, for about 40% of our student body, we are covering about $25,000 of that 53 for about 40% of the student body. It's about a $75 million a year expense for us. And the way we cover that is about half of our student body can pay the full cost, and we do a tremendous amount of philanthropic engagement with our community to try to ensure that we both have current use dollars and endowment dollars to help us cover the difference. It would be in all of our interests if we could keep our costs down, because we're covering the increase on 40% of those students rather significantly. And so why do costs go up? Well, each of our institutions are engaged in a very competitive context to ensure that we're providing the very best kind of experience for the people who come to us. And that ensures that we have the very best faculty engaged in the very best scholarship and research possible, and that we have very best students, and many of those students come with the kind of financial aid need that we've been describing. And so the biggest expenses that we incur and the growth rates incur really in areas where we're trying to engage in the most significant scholarly and research activities that we possibly can. If we weren't engaged in that, it'd be a little more manageable to be able to sustain costs, because we have a pretty good fix on some of the other things that we do. But if you gave any one of us $1 today, we could tell you how we would spend it in the most valuable way possible, and I don't think you'd have a disagreement that it would be a valuable way for us to be using those resources. So it's because we're engaged in this competitive context of trying to really pursue scholarship and research at the highest possible levels, there's sort of an open-ended quality to the level of investment that we could be making in our institutions. And we try to ensure the affordability for our students. There's a concomitant engagement that we have in trying to provide the financial capacity to support that.
It's interesting. I mean, you've all talked about costs and competition. And in most markets where one talks about cost and competition, one also then talks about quality. How does a parent, how does a student, how do taxpayers assess quality in higher education? And is that a threatening question to university presidents? I mean, we live in a world now in higher education dominated, I think many of us would say regrettably, by something like a U.S. News and World Report kind of ranking, which talks about wealth and selectivity and maybe publications of faculty, maybe dropout rate, alumni giving, and the like. But how do we know if any of those things have anything to do with the quality of the education that students receive? How would you respond to that, each of you, about quality? What do you say to a parent who's saying, all right, I understand how much it costs. I don't understand why it's gone up so much more than anything else in our budgets. But what can you tell me about the quality, and how do I know?
Well, the quality question, of course, is always a perplexing one. You can look at it from the inputs and you can look at it from the outputs side. So I think the universities, all of us, first of all, we do our part on both the input side and the output side of this. On the input side, we try to have current, relevant, exciting programs. And by the way, students tell you what they want. This competition issue is not just driven by having faculty will compete with Georgetown's faculty or Howard's faculty. It's the students. Every spring, students and their parents make this tour around the United States and visit half a dozen or 10 universities, and they look for what they're going to get out of it. And they tend to drive the quality of their experience up. That's been going on for decades. So a lot of the improvements in universities has actually been driven by the marketplace in terms of what people are expecting to get.
That's why I see such beautiful gymnasiums at all the colleges.
That could be. That could be. Alumni like those too, actually. I mean, so the marketplace is actually driving the quality as well as the strictly academic side. So, but in terms of directly your question, on the input side, it's basically providing the programs that will excite students, especially the best students, to come and participate. On the output side, I think the best measure is what the marketplace is saying about the quality of your students. What do you hear? What do you get back? Graduate schools, are they accepting your students to graduate school? Are they accepting them to law schools at a high rate? Are the employers saying nice things about your graduates and what their capability is? Are your students excited about their experience, and do they want to continue their education going forward? Because, of course, this is a time of continuing education. So you have to monitor. This is kind of soft monitoring, but I think it's very significant. You're looking constantly for pride. Pride is the key word. Everyone wants to hear pride. Pride among alumni, pride among the students, pride among the community. And you're looking for expectations of excellence. You want someone to tell you they have an expectation of excellence about your institution in this area. Those are soft, but I think very meaningful measures of how you're doing.
President Ribeau, what?
Yeah. I would say that for those who track the polls, the rankings that come out on an annual basis, that's only a starting point. Don't be confused by that. Because how an institution is ranked depends on the input variables, as President Mote said, and that's not necessarily what leads to student success. I'll answer this from a parental point of view as well as a university administrator. What really determines whether or not Sidney or John would be successful at whatever school they go to is not the accolades of the faculty or the buildings. It's how well there's a fit between Sidney and Georgetown, or Sidney and Howard. Does the institution and the programs that it offers create an environment that stimulates students to learn and to achieve? Because once intellectually students are stimulated, not just for grades, not just to be in the elite academically recognizable group, then they'll be successful. So I think on the quality issue, and I say this, and I've done this as recently as last year, you look at all of the best. My daughter was interested in communication, the best communication programs in the country. And so she looked at Howard, and she looked here, and she looked there. Then I said, go visit. We will go with you. Talk to the faculty. Talk to other students to see if your learning style, your motivation, who you are as a person will fit that environment. And you can see yourself 4 or 5 years from now leaving there, as President Mote said, proud of your achievement. So I think we put too much pressure on rankings of everything. Not against them. Talk to my board of trustees about them often. But it's a starting point. It's a starting point for the dialogue. If it's your concluding point, then you're not, I think, doing the complete job that you should do.
I think embedded in both Dan and Sidney's comments are this recognition that there are tangible things that we can measure and count and be accountable for, and then there are intangible things that are more subtle. They're more about the quality of your community, the ability to provide a framework for engagement for your students and your faculty, and having the right balance between those. And there is a question that isn't, or there's an issue embedded in your question, Elliot, that I think is central to what all of higher education is wrestling with is, to what degree will we be accountable for the responsibilities that we have within our society? If we're going to be so significant a part of the economy, if we're going to be so significant in terms of preparing our nation for future competitiveness in our world, are we responsible for the resources that we have at our command right now, and are we using them in the best possible way?
Well, that question or comment about accountability is obviously an enormously important one, and let's think about the state of the economy today. I mean, obviously many people would say the purpose, or some people at least would say, the purpose of higher education is to teach critical thinking, and it's a very abstract, subjective preparation for whatever. But others might say it's much more instrumental than that. It's to prepare people for employment. And what in a time like this, where people are writing now about the profound effects of this recession on your students who graduated last year, who are going to graduate this year, what are you doing at your own institutions about that? Do you think you have any obligation as an institution to them to sort out what kind of opportunities they may have? Are students now thinking outside the box more about kinds of employment opportunities? Are they thinking about staying in school as long as possible until things might get better? What are the particular challenges to you as heads of major institutions at a time that is perhaps unprecedented in its lack of employment opportunities for your graduates? Maybe start this time with you.
Sure. I was just smiling when you were asking the question because we have sort of a way of thinking about this within the context of our history and our tradition at Georgetown. The leader of the Jesuit order for 25 years, Father Peter Hans Kolvenbach, gave a beautiful talk a few years ago in which he said that we evaluate our universities, our Jesuit universities, by what our students become. And very high-minded and morally centered for us, who do our students become? But there can be no confusion that the instrumental quality that you described is an expectation beneath that. So yes, there's a tremendous focus on the character of the individual, the quality of the mind, the capacity for liberal learning. And there's also a recognition that if you're going to come and spend $53,000 a year, you better be employable when this is over. And so we think a lot about this. I guess the crisis hasn't really hit us yet at the undergraduate level with our undergraduate students. We haven't seen a significant change, for example, in who's interviewing and the kinds of firms and the kinds of organizations coming to campus at this point in time for our undergraduates. Where we are seeing it is at professional level, particularly in our law school. We're in our second year where our students are typically going out and doing internships in very, very rarefied contexts. That's, right now we're seeing some real challenge in placing our second years. And will they, because that placement in the second year is really important for what happens after third. And right now, that's the biggest challenge that we're wrestling with in our context is the professional student.
What about your experiences at your campuses?
I'd say that for certain, the number of interviews per graduate has been reduced in the last few years. In the business school, we might have had 10 to 12 per graduate. Now we might have 6. So there is, for us, a difference in the marketplace. Our most capable students are not having trouble being placed. The top tier, that top 10%, they're still highly recruited and they have choices. Perhaps not as many choices, Elliot, as they had a few years ago, but they still have choices. It's the solid B student and other students that might have more of a challenge. A couple things that we are trying to emphasize, and it's not fully developed yet. and it links to the whole idea of a liberal education. Historically, Howard also has been an institution committed to a holistic liberal education. We started out as a university 1867 to prepare preachers and teachers, and that was the challenge of the charge. And so the service orientation is very, very important as the university has grown. We've tried to take the liberal arts core, the problem solving, the critical thinking, the reflective analysis, all the things that grow out of a liberal education, couple it with engagement and entrepreneurship. Students are much more interested now in the idea of running their own operation, of being able to be self-employed, independent of the downturn in the economy in the last few years. You know, the idea that they want to be in charge of their own operation, and we're trying to give them the skills. We were able to get a grant for, in most of our universities, I know have programs in entrepreneurship that are connected to the business school or not, or with a major or a minor, but trying to give them the tools to build upon the liberal education in a way to be able to start and run their own operation, develop a business plan, find out how to get angels to invest in your operation. I mean, but we're trying to give them skills that in the past probably weren't as important as they are today. So they could have some skills or some capabilities of their own. We're finding that more of our students are placing more of an emphasis on internships and placements early on to get their foot in the door so companies can see them and can work with them, doing volunteer work in school districts and community-based organizations. I think we have more students involved in community-based organizations and activities as a viable option now as the job market changes. So I think part of our approach is to get them out into the workplace, in many cases on a volunteer basis. These are not our volunteer positions, but learn from that what they want to do and expose the employers to the skills and capabilities they bring to the situation.
Dan, in College Park, what's your sense of the mood of your graduating seniors or the seniors this year looking at the job market? And do you feel a responsibility to respond to that?
Well, certainly the short-term job opportunities are many fewer, and some students that have just graduated in, let's say, in December don't have jobs yet, to be sure. And it's a worsening circumstance, as no surprise to anybody here. And the university does things to facilitate the opportunities for students to get jobs, no doubt about that. In addition to things that Sidney was talking about in dealing with the communities, internships, for example. Internships is one of the best access points for getting jobs. So increasing emphasis on internships, either with government or industry, partnerships with large companies as well. But I think another aspect of this, of course, universities are not short-term operations. They actually don't respond quickly. So it's very difficult for us to be an employment agency. But I think we can help the students understand that they are entering into a period of profound and rapid and accelerating change. And this is a national global issue that's going underway. They cannot be unglued by the fact that the world is changing, because in fact the world is changing faster and faster all the time. CNN recently said that the amount of new information created in 2009 was more than the total of all information accumulated in 5,000 years. The rate of technology development doubles. The amount of technology available doubles every 2 years. So the world is changing very rapidly. Companies are going out of business. New companies are going to come in. They haven't come in yet. I implore our students to create these companies because that's the way small businesses are essentially where the new jobs are going to be created. They need to think. They need to get their mind around a very rapidly changing world in which jobs are going to not be career jobs. They're going to be jobs, each graduate will have 10 jobs at least by the time they're 35 years old. That's the national statistic. I think that number is going to increase. So the whole world in which they're entering is a job market and other things is very, very different than it was 10 years ago.
A different kind of topic. You each lead institutions of national and increasingly, as I said, international significance, yet you're located here in Greater Washington. How does what does that mean for each of your institutions? I mean, in terms of how you see yourselves, the opportunities you have, or indeed the challenges that location may present. And maybe we'll start with you, Sidney, on this one.
Sure. I'm smiling to myself because it's a double-edged sword. I mean, you're here with all the funding agencies, the National Science Foundation, and all the national institutes, the federally funded funding agencies for research, the foundations, the professional associations have their headquarters here. So you have access in a way that other institutions throughout the country don't, if you're in Wisconsin or if you're in Maine. So that's a plus. But there are more people with access to you also. Congressional Hill and, and congresspersons, senators and congressmen and women who want and expect, that the institution, be of assistance and serve in a variety of different kinds of ways. You're highly visible. I think our institutions have access to a national stage or platform that other institutions that are quality institutions throughout the country don't necessarily have. And that's a good thing. Coming from Ohio, where you might call ahead of a foundation or organization 3 times and might or might not get your call returned, you can go to the building and see them here. So that's on the plus side, because the resource base and the excitement is here. And that's, I think, something that we all can benefit from. The social obligations that go along with that. And we were talking, John and I just, when we were back in the back room, you don't want your institution not to be well represented in any setting, because you just don't know what discussion, dialogue, opportunity might grow out of it. So if you're not careful, you could have a job embedded in a job, which is a full-time job, is being places and meeting people and spending time with folks who are interested in Howard University, in my case, perhaps, but that's every evening, every weekend, so you have, I think, that dual dynamic. But things that you can, I'd say for me, that you can accomplish being in this area, in the district, and in this corridor, it's immensely more positive than anything else.
Well, I would concur with everything that Sidney just said. For Georgetown, we were founded in 1789. And so we've grown up with the city, we've grown up with the government, and it is so inextricably a part of our very identity as a university that we wouldn't be Georgetown if we weren't here in Washington. It's, every day for our students is a civics lesson, and we never know who's going to pop over to campus at the invitation of a faculty member or a student group. It's just thrilling to be 18 to 22 years of age and to be here in this city and watch everything taking place, and for our faculty to have the ability to draw from the resources of the city, to sometimes be some of those resources. We had 12 members of our faculty brought into the current administration. We look forward to bringing them back at some point soon. But it's just been so much a part of who we are as a university to be here in Washington, that our curriculum, our strengths in terms of our academic programs, I think one of the dominant reasons why students want to come to the university is to be at a university here in the city of Washington. We just wouldn't be who we are without this location.
Dan, for you?
I agree completely with my colleagues, even though we're not in the district, but are inside the Beltway. I refer to our location as our great unfair advantage. It's our great unfair advantage. It is just marvelous. Unfair advantages are advantages you have and other people don't have and they can't get. That's a difference between competitive advantage. You can lose your competitive advantage. You cannot lose your unfair advantage. For a large research university that sees itself having international presence and responsibilities, I mean, nothing could be better to be located in the nation's capital, surrounded by these acronyms.
Did this help with your new relationship with the people, with China?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Oh, the reason I'm big pals with all the people higher ups in the PRC is because of the fact that they want to have people that have access to the U.S. government, know how it works, and we have programs. We've trained thousands of Chinese administrators and so on. I could spend a lot of time talking about.
Maybe the president need some help with you over the arms sales to Taiwan and a few other problems.
But our goal as a campus is to have an ongoing intimate and financially active relationship with every government acronym around us. And we have people who have these responsibilities to build these, and in fact, they're been very successful. We have faculty members who lead NASA spaceflight missions and so on. And we also send people to government, as Jack does, and we get them from government, by the way. Very skilled, capable people with excellent experience who, when the government changes, they need a landing site, they don't want to sell their house, they can come to the University of Maryland and continue and help us enormously in terms of their accesses and experiences and add dimension to our program. So you just can't overemphasize the advantage of being here.
Great. We're going to open things up, but before that we do that, I just want to make a couple of comments and thanks in particular. I want to thank Elmer Gildenhorn, as always. Our trustee is so generous to help us with these programs. Also Michelle Smith and Liz Dugan, who I don't think could be here today, for their particular contributions to this. And I also understand that each of the presidents invited 2 of their students to be in the audience, and we welcome them very much, and perhaps they as well will ask some questions. So let me turn it open to all of you, and please identify yourself and indicate whether your question is directed to one of the presidents or to the panel. Please.
Elliot, if I could, I'd love to pick up on the last question that you presented, but with a slightly different perspective. And that is, I'm very interested in what I call the end of isolation for higher education, and particularly looking at a number of states like New Mexico that have adopted a K-16, K-20 policy. I'm involved in a couple of foundations that are trying to bring instructional innovation into the K-12 classroom to address particularly what Dr. Ribeau mentioned, the underrepresentation of men of color in higher education. Has to start with the work in K-12 and not just in high school. And that's where the work of our foundations are really focused right now. So what I'm interested in hearing is not just your excellent question about how do you feel about being in Washington. I'd like to know how you feel about your responsibility for and connectedness to DC public schools, where the graduation rate is so low that I can't even speak it, and the percentage of those that do graduate from DC public schools and successfully complete a 4-year higher education experience is 3%. So when you talk about underrepresentation of men of color in higher education, it really has to do with what we're doing at the K-12 level. So my question to you is, how do you view that, and what are you doing about it?
And perhaps how many graduates of DC public schools do you have in your institutions?
Well, I'll start. Prior to my arrival at Howard University, so I can take no credit for this, a math and science middle school was established, a charter school, which is part of the DC school district, was started on our campus. A highly successful program, and it's designed specifically to address the need of underrepresentation in math and science for students of color. The unique twist on it is that the teachers in the school are teachers that come from traditional disciplines, but not colleges of education necessarily. So at the same time they're teaching, they might have a major in biology or a major in mathematics, but not a math education degree. They're getting certified to teach, so they can go out and teach, not teach with us or teach elsewhere, and also work at the school. Very high success rate, very high graduation rate, and it's something that I think the district looks upon as being positive. I know we have a relationship with a number of schools, high schools, and schools within the district, and I'm sure my colleagues do also. That being said, though, and those are all wonderful things, I feel that we need to do more. We being higher education, now I'm not speaking for Howard, and getting out and working with the K through 12 community as a partner to develop curricula, new pedagogy. We know the kinds of things that work in preparing students to be successful in the K through 16 continuum at those early stages. Our coffers are replete with literature about teaching and learning and outcome-based learning, but we need to get our specialists together, directly working with the English teachers and the reading teachers in the schools to help bring the new research and the cutting edge work, to the environment where it can be employed and used, with our public schools. It's not easy because that's not our primary business as a college or university. But I sat on the Governor's Commission on teacher prep for the state of Ohio and looking at what is a highly qualified teacher. I think in order to really flesh out that definition, our faculty members can be, and I would like to see them more involved in hands-on, not just writing about it, but clinically involved, in that development.
In our case, one of the presenting questions for us is how are we using our institutional agency to make a difference in responding to just the challenge that you described? And I guess I'd say two things. The first, over the last, I'd say 5 or 6 years, but it does go back a bit longer, probably more like 15 when we began working on some of this, but it became somewhat institutionalized internal to Georgetown in an initiative we call the Ward 7 initiative, where the university is trying to deploy the resources that we have available to us to try to make a difference in improving the quality of K through 12 in Ward 7. Probably the piece of that that's had the most impact is a project that we've engaged. It's called the Myers College Prep Initiative, and what we've been doing with this program is taking roughly 50 sixth graders each year in Ward 7 and put them in a program which brings them to our campus every Saturday for most of the day on Saturday, and then we have them for a good part of the summer. And we add a cohort each year, and so we're at the point with some funding that we received from the Myers Foundation. We've been able to scale this up to a point where we think we have a project that's worth paying attention to in terms of an example. It would look familiar to other things that you would have been involved in over the past. It looks a lot like an Upward Bound program. In our case, it's that sustained commitment to a group of sixth graders all the way through 12th grade. And what's been interesting for us, you know the numbers in terms of the district. We've had a 98% high school graduation rate for those who have participated in this, and an 85% college graduation rate for those who've been in the program long enough to be a part of it. So the numbers are sort of kind of just unlike what they would be if we didn't, but for this intervention. But I guess what I would say too is it's a project. This is not, I think, reflective of the kind of institutional engagement that I think was embedded in your question. And I think truly that a decade from now, if we are answering this question, if we're answering it in somewhat similar ways to the way we are today, I don't think we would view any of our efforts to be successful. There really is, this is a moment for a very deepened kind of engagement. And I think we're all trying to look for that. We don't have, for example, a school of education. The largest employer of Georgetown students at graduation the last 2 years has been Teach for America. And there's something that is going on here that we want to pay attention to and we want to be a part of. We recognize the numbers that you've shared in the district and our own effort at intervention, but whatever we're doing is simply not sufficient to the challenge that we face as a city.
Dan, what about your involvement with Prince George's County?
Yeah, because we're in Prince George's County, we actually focus on that. And Prince George's is a challenged educational system as well. And we have an education school, and we're heavily engaged in Prince George's County. I think this is the type of problem, though, you never can quite do enough. But I'll give you some examples. There's a local Paint Branch Elementary School that we have worked with the principal there and give courses and programs there. We actually are introducing Chinese language in this elementary school. Actually took a tour of students from this school to China last year, for example, to give them this expanded educational experience. In Bladensburg, we are operating with 5 schools in Bladensburg, 3 primary schools, 1 middle school, Bladensburg High School, with a program called Urban Education and Minority Achievement to essentially help the teachers, upgrade the teachers, working with our education school faculties and others to raise themselves. That has shown very good progress as well. Prince George's County Council has supported educational programs we have with our incentive awards program to bring students who have overcome great challenges to university very helpfully. Professor of Physics Jim Gates is on the State Board of Education, and he is very engaged in Prince George's County educational issues, even though he's a string theorist in physics. And of course, so I think the university is trying its best to be engaged in the state's educational system as a whole, but especially in Prince George's County. This is an ongoing activity, I would say.
Question.
Alma?
Alma.
I'm here wearing 3 hats today. One is Aspen, my interest in Georgetown Medical Center, but my heart belongs to the University of Maryland, as many of you know. I would ask, because I went to Maryland and involved almost daily at the university, I would like to ask Dr. Mote an answer and to enlarge upon the question about our Baltimore incentive program, which you founded, Dr. Mote, that really, really helps improve the diversity of the university. I'm also very concerned about what you recognized a long time ago, that the average student graduates with $30,000 in debt, which is an untenable amount of money in order for them to sustain themselves, to get an apartment, to get a job. I mean, it's hard to pay that back, and what we're doing out there. And also, you can't gloss over the economic situation that we find ourselves in. And at the university, we've started a program that has concerned Dr. Mote very deeply, and all of us, and that's to keep the young people at Maryland who are there already. They started out being able to afford it, and a lot of the parents over the past 18 months have lost jobs. It's a very, very big problem now of student need. And we're just, I would say we're knocking ourselves out to find funds to keep students in school. And our program's called Keep Me Maryland. And you cannot trivialize that program. But I digress. I would like to ask Dr. Mote to comment on the Baltimore incentive program.
She has an excellent presentation. Alma, Keep Me Maryland is also it's a great program. The incentive awards program, just briefly, if I can make it brief, we have 4,000 freshmen every year, plus or minus. When I arrived in Maryland, I noted that from Baltimore City high schools, all of them academic and non-academic public high schools, that we were bringing in 40 students per year. And so you have the state's great city, the flagship university, 40 students out of 4,000 are coming from Baltimore. Actually, I had this experience before in California. I was at Berkeley. The same question was asked me by somebody from San Francisco. Why doesn't San Francisco high school send students to Berkeley? So I brought a program to Baltimore that had already started in Berkeley, and it was called the Incentive Awards Program. Basically, working with the community and school districts in a specific number of high schools, you identify students who have overcome significant challenges in their circumstances. It's not just that they need money. It's basically they, of course, need money, but they've had a very, very tough situation, and they've demonstrated a capacity to succeed, nonetheless, overcoming all these challenges. You know, one young woman, for example, her house burned down, her mother and 3 sisters were killed. She lost all her belongings. She's on the street with nothing. She's a junior in high school. Another Russian girl who was 13 years old was dropped off in Baltimore, couldn't speak English. Her father she was going to live with, disowned her, so she's wandering the streets by herself. Can't speak English, she's 13 years old. And works it out, and somehow or other is able to not have the greatest qualifications, but have qualifications. We identify these students, we fund them room and board, tuition, and fees for 4 years, we guarantee that. They join this club of similar students. They engage in the university. They go back to their schools once a semester to talk to other students about why it's important to be a student at the university. You know, girls, football, studies, whatever the students talk to each other about, and counselors, to try to recreate the pipelines between these schools and the university, because the pipelines get broken, and that's what one of the big failures. The program has been very successful, even though some people in Baltimore told me we would never find a student who could graduate by recruiting students this way. In fact, the graduation rate is just like the university's graduation rate. They go on to law schools, and they go all kinds of places. The sky just opens up for these people. Prince George's County was jealous in a way because we started this in Baltimore because it was the great city, and I was from California. What did I know? So the county council actually has put some significant money in if we would expand this program into Prince George's County, which we have in 5 high schools now in Prince George's County. So it's been a very successful program, but it's essentially looking at the character of the person. You know, strip away the test scores and stuff like that, and you decide whether this person has the character to succeed. And that person's a really good investment. One young woman, I remember exactly the last story on this, was I asked her, I said, why do you want to come to the University of Maryland, this program? She says, this program is going to open doors for me. And then she said, if I get to the wall and there's no door, I'm going through it anyway. Okay. So, check off. That's good. That's good. So anyway, that's that program. That's probably enough on that program.
Okay, another question. Yes, this gentleman.
President Obama has set out a very ambitious objective, and several major foundations have as well, to increase the proportion of graduates among adults in the United States by 2020 or 2025 to the highest international competitive level. All 3 of you have different missions in some respects for your institutions, but my question to you is this: in a time where resources are already spread thin for reasons just described, and at the same time you're being called upon to increase capacity in some ways to raise the number of people who are studying for degrees, can you give an example of how you anticipate doing that, and perhaps with particular reference to the other end of the spectrum, not the young pipeline coming up, but the people who are already 30, 40, 50 years old, who are in the workforce with incompleted academic credentials? Are you finding or conceiving of planning ways to begin to address that quite large population that presumably is part of the answer to the national puzzle?
You know, your question is, I think it's pertinent for the returning student that you're describing, but also for a large percentage of the population of traditional age students who aren't going to colleges or universities. And I think the answer is embedded in the new social networks, the new technology. If you look at the growth of the proprietary, the for-profit schools, the Phoenix and the Stryker or whatever, I mean, Strayer, you know, their numbers are growing exponentially. I mean, it's just like it's skyrocketing, and they're utilizing online instruction, you know, to access a student population that needs certification or needs, in some cases, degree programs. Likewise, if you listen to students about the potential and the new social networks that we have, you know, the Facebooks and the tweets and the Twitters, whatever all those things are, to reach students who haven't been reached of traditional ages. So I think there's answers in those new technologies and how they're utilized. I think the for-profits have a formula. I mean, they have a way to take cost out of the system. They have margins that most businessmen would salivate about. And you look at the profitability. It's not the kind of holistic education you might get at a Howard or at a Georgetown or at a University of Maryland, but it's serving a purpose, I think. So I think that those technologies hold a lot for that adult population, but also, when I referenced earlier the lack of males. So we were talking back there, it's not just African American males aren't participating in higher education at the same rate. Males in general, and you shared with me some numbers about males are not participating. I think we can utilize some of these new social networks to talk with them in a way that they hear us. And the traditional pedagogy and organizational structures of schools aren't doing it in the ways that are reaching these students. So I think there is a high level of potential.
The closest we've come has been the establishment of some very special relationships with a group of community colleges, just to ensure that as part of their framework on the ground, and this we do with PG Community College, Montgomery College, have a relationship with Northern Virginia Community College, and then a few others like Miami-Dade, where just by virtue of our presence here and our history and the relationships that have evolved over time, there's a very modest pipeline of students, but they're still pretty traditional age students, and that would be the case about Georgetown generally. Is we pretty much have a pretty traditional age population, and I don't think that will change very much as we move forward. The changing dynamics, as Sidney just described, we have no argument with the President's articulation of a national policy which would require more and more Americans to be pursuing post-secondary education. In our case, though, I think it will likely be a modest contribution to providing a framework in which some community colleges would view us as a destination point for students who begin there.
Patrick?
Universities have been globalizers in the past, and it's continue to be that way. I used to teach at the University of Maryland, both in Europe and Asia and China. What I notice is Maryland does not have a sunset. They are very global in, I think, about 78 countries, something like that.
Yeah.
And also with Georgetown, you have a new campus in the Middle East. And my question is, even though we drive from here, Washington, but how much the impact you have from those global forces coming toward here? How much is the transformation that's taking place in as incubators of knowledge locally, but the impact is global and coming back in the recycling way? And how do you envision that kind of world that university is going to play in the future as it was in the past? Just like going back to Nalanda University, first university established in 5,000 years ago in northern India.
Well, the global enterprise, basically there are no U.S. companies anymore. There are only multinational companies. So the corporate sector has become globalized very effectively, and the major research universities who are living on this globe in the same way have to be in the kind of same framework if they're going to deal with government issues and corporate issues as well. So I think we see ourselves as having this kind of a global positioning, and it's important for our students, very important for our students, to gain a global perspective while they're undergraduate students. That's why we are doing our best to get every student outside the country before they graduate, because you can't be an educated person in 2010 unless you have a real visceral understanding of other culture and how they live and think and so forth. So the global interchange is very important, and I think it affects the way we think also. That is, so as it comes back to the campus, it affects the way we think, the programs we put together, the expectations of our student programs. So it has a very great effect on us. And we engage in not just educational programs, but actually dealing with governments and programs and training executives and the training programs as well as degree programs. Right now, Jiangsu province, for example, sent 110 managers. They're kind of middle executives. They're not the highest level, but they're going to be the highest level. They've been selected to spend a year getting a Master's of Public Management through public policy, a regular master's degree program, getting a 2-year program in one year. It's a kind of killing pace, frankly. And then they'll spend 3 months in China, and they'll get this degree. There'll be a big graduation ceremony with the party secretary in Jiangsu, Liang Baohua. So these kinds of interchanges. We have a program in Abu Dhabi on dealing with the sheikhs there on the Petroleum Institute, creating that program. So I think the global interplay is very rich and very active, and the more our students understand this, the better off they're going to be going forward in the world that they're going to live in.
I'd just add a word to it. Historically, we've had, as part of our identity as an institution, a very international character, in large part because we're located here. 135 countries are represented in our student body, and half of our students will study abroad during their undergraduate years. Faculty are engaged all over the world in different kinds of work. But you mentioned the fact that we've taken a new step, and that new step reflects some of the global dynamics that Dan is referring to, and that is we've put a campus in Doha, in Qatar. We're part of Education City, and we're teaching international relations to undergraduates in the region. About 40% or so of the students will come from the country of Qatar. The rest will come from about 30 other countries in the greater Gulf and greater Middle East region. We're sending, this year we'll probably have about 17 full-time members of our faculty from here in Washington will be on the ground in Doha for the year or longer. Some have been as long as 5 years already. We do expect that they will return at some point to campus, and we do expect that that's going to have a different kind of impact on our institution as we move forward. It's going to be a very positive one. We're looking forward to just seeing what will unfold in terms of what that new dynamic will mean for us as a university community.
I think we have a question from a student, perhaps, over against the wall.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I want to say thank you for inviting the students. It's a pleasure. I also want to thank Dr. Ribeau for giving us the invitation. My name is Victoria Kirby. I am a proud graduate of Howard University and a first-year master's student in our public administration program at Howard. My question is actually directed to President Mote at University of Maryland. I'm interested in one day becoming a president of a university or college one day myself, and so.
Maybe you'll discourage it.
Come on, Mo, tell her what to do.
Yeah, I've got it.
He got it.
Does he have an opportunity for you?
You better get this right.
Yeah, okay. I'm
Question
on
I really
record.
want to know.
Stop the
One of
camera.
my friends, close friends, every year participates in a regional women's flag football competition on your campus. And I always notice your lovely sports complex. And so my question for you is, how has the University of Maryland, particular College Park, your campus, how have you been able to really reach out to some of those corporate sponsors and kind of develop those relationships to build some of those very nice facilities that I'm sure many universities across the country envy? What type of process or model does the University of Maryland College Park employ? And what kind of successes have you all had using those models with Comcast or some of the other corporate sponsors that you all have accumulated over the years?
Oh, thank you very much for your good plug for everybody. And the facility is actually remarkable, and I could tell you some stories about how it came to be. First of all, good luck on being a university president. It's actually a very privileged job. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. It's a wonderful job. In fact, you spend your whole life trying to find a job where you can actually do something. Everybody wants a job that can actually do something, and you can do it as a university president. So you can get there if you want. Just be excellent at something first. Don't try to be a president before you're excellent at something first. That's my advice. As far as the facilities and so forth, I think we have a University of Maryland College Park Foundation Board. Alma Gildenhorn happens to be a member of this board, and a number of other people. Of course, it's a very, and I think it's part of relationship building. The university is very privileged. As I said, it's located here in Washington, Greater Washington. It's a flagship university of the state of Maryland. It has a significant position in the state. It's a very significant board. You have all the unfair advantages you need to build relationships with corporations and with others who want to be associated with a large, high visibility place that will give them pride from being associated with it. And then you just sell it to them in using various kinds of creative strategies you can think of that would be helpful for them and make it work for them. And I think not just University of Maryland, but you can see around the country that a place has been able to do that. And be entrepreneurial and creative and inventive and think to the future all the time, build the future constantly. Everybody sells the future.
Over here. I have time for probably a couple more questions, but we are going to end at 1:30.
I'll be quick. I'm Hal Plotkin. I'm a senior policy advisor in the Office of the Undersecretary of Education. which, as many of you know, has responsibility for all federal programs related to and policies related to higher education. Before that, I was the president of a community college board of trustees in California. And when we talk with the students who are the targets of President Obama's initiative to increase graduation, they frequently bring up two items that they've called to our attention. One of them is their desire for accelerated learning, and the desire, particularly among older students, think of all the unemployed auto workers, for example, who maybe have a high school education, but who have picked up a considerable amount of skills, knowledge, and abilities in their lifetime, for the awarding of academic credit for their independently obtained knowledge and skills, so that they can enter the higher education system at a point where it's most useful to them and not have their time wasted. The federal government makes an enormous investment in higher education generally and in all of your institutions in a variety of different methods. What mechanisms could the federal government employ, in your opinion, that would increase the productivity of the higher education system while maintaining degree quality?
Well, that's certainly a...
That sounds like a Jack DeGioia question.
It is a great question. And I think it is, to the earlier point regarding federal policy, I don't think there's a more important one that we're going to be wrestling with, because I do think if we're going to be able to compete as a nation going forward, we're going to need to crack the code on deepening the level of learning for all of our people. It's a great question. So I'll throw out just a couple of ideas. I think what you have represented here, for example, are three very different institutions, each of us with unique strengths, unique talents, unique resources. But I don't think by any means would we feel that we've exhausted our capacity to make a contribution to addressing the questions that you just raised. How could we do that is something that we're not familiar with, in the sense that Georgetown, for example, wouldn't really know how to organize ourselves to try to wrestle with the question of what of our resources would be useful in either supporting an accelerated learning model or would enable us to do the work that would enable us to assess the learning that's already taken place in a person's life. Could we be a part of such an initiative? I think so. Could three of us in our institutions collaboratively working, using perhaps some of the kinds of social networking tools that Sidney was making reference to, could we be part of an effort to try to address this? I think so. What we have are some of the most extraordinary resources the planet's ever seen in terms of the students and faculty that are on our campuses. We do have our missions, and we need to fulfill those missions, but when you look at the kind of resources that we've been able to build up over the course of our years, there's capacity here that can be deployed in a way that could address these challenges. Does that mean we could absorb students on our own campus? That I don't know. Could we make available some of our resources in a way that could enhance a collaborative venture that might engage a group of institutions? That might be another way we could do it. But I do think we have to be part of the solution. How we do that, I think, is an effort that will define this administration, and how our institutions engage, I think, is going to be the challenge that we all have to respond to.
See, I would add that I agree with everything that John said. I would add to it that it goes back to an earlier question about on one level we have to deal with the pipeline. We have to deal with the pre-K pipeline all the way through the system, and there's ways that we can engage to do that. At the other end of the continuum, you look at our institutional missions. We know at the state level, there are things that are happening. Alternative licensures for teachers. In Ohio, there within the pods of different universities, credit for experiential learning is possible within the institutions. Now, that's not at a policy level. Okay? That's at an institutional. If you're at Ohio State University, or I was at Bowling Green State University, we had a whole group of faculty members that had coalesced around that issue. But it has to happen. It has to come from the culture and be consistent with the mission. If we don't have a large continuing education operation, then we might not be a major player, but we could be the architects of some of the components that the players implement. And so I think, there can be more collaboration amongst institutions, but you have to have the end game in sight very clearly and separate it. The pre-K to pre-K through 16, what that looks like. I mean, master's degrees for job improvement or enhancement are very hot now, and those can be done online. That's one of the things that the Phoenixes of the world are actually doing, and they're capitalizing on. So there are things like that. Again, it has to be consistent with the mission of the University of Maryland or the University of whatever, or Howard University. But we do have intellectual capital that we can bring to bear on it. And what the government, I think, can do is help facilitate those discussions so the players can bring the skills.
Yeah, I'll give Dan the last word here.
I think one of the key words that fits into the effectively can be done is graduation rate. Graduation rate has to increase. That's the single biggest stumbling block. Graduation rates are too low. There isn't a shortage of capacity, by the way. There's a lot of capacity that's out there. So it's not having enough capacity for this 25% increase in students, graduates. But it's graduation rate is the problem, and not lack of continuation. And I agree with Sidney that the master's degree tune-up is a very straightforward, easy thing to do. Most universities have those. You can create those programs very flexibly. They don't create a big problem. And credit for life's experience, to some extent we all do that now. For internships, for example, you can get credit while you're in an internship. You can get credit for international study. Whether an auto mechanic, for example, would get credit would be depending on what program they're going into and whether you had that program at your university, that sort of thing.
Do you think those programs are sufficiently robust that grant academic credit for independently obtained knowledge and skills?
No, I don't actually.
Good answer.
I don't. But a lot of people seem to do it. You can sell degrees that way,
Yeah, that's true. So the challenge is to maintain the degree quality.
Right.
That's where leaders
Right.
like yourself are so important.
Right.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And they are very important. And on behalf of our audience and the Aspen Institute, I'd just like to thank our three distinguished leaders for sharing their time with us this afternoon. Thank you again.
Thank you.
John, before you run out here, I wanted to ask you about something. I have a...
That was great. Yeah.